How often do you think about the river? How much do you even know about it? In a way, for those of you living in the drainage, it's why many of you are even here. It certainly was for the Abenaki, who thrived on the river's salmon. Today's villages and towns may not have developed as they have had its floods and meanderings not deposited its rich soils over thousands of years. Were it devoid of its multiple tributaries, mills wouldn't have been built and communities wouldn't have prospered around them. Old and new Route 30s, side roads, railroads, all were designed around its floodplain. Throughout the subsequent years, these byways have brought to the valley commerce, tourism, a way of life, a means of life. A stretch? Perhaps. Maybe all the river means is a beautiful backdrop marking the end of long drives to the slopes or holiday visits with relatives. It could simply be that last whitewater rush which will sustain souls through the long winter until spring runoff. Maybe it means a cooling way to connect with neighbors and friends in the summer heat. It might be a means to commune with something larger than ourselves. Regardless, this river flowing through the heart of Windham County is a part of our lives. 46 miles. That's what it travels from its official start in the hills of Mount Holly to its end in Brattleboro. Its watershed encompasses 423 square miles. By comparison, the Connecticut into which it flows is almost 10 times as long, with a watershed 26 times larger. While it's not known to everyone in New England, its significance to those living, working, and playing in and alongside it cannot be overstated. The Abenaki called it Wantosticket, meaning waters of the lonely way. Today, it is called the West River.
If we were here about, 20,000 years ago, we'd have, good 5,000–6,000 feet of ice over us. And that completely sculpted this landscape. So all the, sort of the topographic settings we see on the hills around us, the slopes, all glacially carved. And not only that, the glaciers deposited, as they were retreating, all sorts of materials as well. When they were here, there was so much weight from the ice that it actually pushed the crust we're standing on down into the mantle of the earth about 400 feet. And then as the ice started melting out, starting about 18,000 years ago, from the very southern reaches of its extent, and started backing, its way back up towards Labrador, as that ice, those southern regions became ice-free, with all that pressure release, they started ramping up out of the mantle of the earth, so that sort of the continental crust of New England was tipped up to the south a few hundred feet, which then blocked all the meltwater trying to get out towards the sea, coming out from the glaciers. It backed it up in huge proglacial lakes. So the biggest proglacial lake in this region was Lake Hitchcock, that sort of formed from central Connecticut all the way up to Canada. The whole thing was a big lake that backed up there. And it backed up its tributaries, so it also backed up into the West River watershed.
When the ice melts away, then, just like somebody getting up from a couch, suddenly the cushions rebound, the Earth's crust rebounded, the glacial Lake Hitchcock drained away, and geologists looking at the shoreline deposits can compute that the land was tilted at a rate of 9/10 of a meter per kilometer as you go north-northwest. And you can project the shoreline on a map and just follow it, and it's by projecting that idealized shoreline on a map that I was coming up the West River Valley, got to Black Mountain, and found on the map that this spot might be a shoreline. Came along here on foot. Sure enough, it is a shoreline. It's a flat, long sandbar that's exactly the right elevation to be the shoreline deposit of Glacial Lake Hitchcock. It's sandy, it's a long spit of land, the elevation's right. There it is. Up above us is perched a floodplain that was first revealed once Glacial Lake Hitchcock had drained. And then, once that lake was gone, the West River and the Connecticut River could erode their way very easily through these soft lake bottom and river bottom sediments. Down through the centuries, the rivers eroded, creating a floodplain here, another floodplain below, creating a stair-step pattern of perched old floodplains, then a steep bank, then another floodplain, and so on down. A stair-step pattern of terraces created by river floodplains. These are the lowest terraces we find along our river valleys.
Many of the metamorphic rocks in the state of Vermont, including the West River watershed here, have good levels of calcium in them. That's important because what that means is that when that bedrock weathers, or when the glaciers ground it up and then deposited as till, it meant there was a good level of calcium in the soil. And calcium tends to buffer soils. So we get soils that are, around neutral pH. And when you get soils that are around neutral pH, then you have a lot of other very important plant nutrients like magnesium, potassium, phosphorus. So I was mentioning the floodplain, we have these very rich soils. A lot of that is derived from the weathered bedrock. And that had a big influence, on the West River Valley as well as the whole state of Vermont, because it was graced with this metamorphic rock that weathered into fine, nutrient-rich soils. It promoted a lot of agriculture. That's why Vermont, has such a rich agricultural history, is because of its soils.
What is the basis of our inherent attraction to rivers? For some, it's the negative ions radiating from waterfalls or rapids. With others, it's a visual thing, the dynamic of an ever-moving system. Perhaps it's the sense of place and connection we gain, living within the natural boundaries surrounding them. Like old friends, rivers can influence us without our even realizing it. Long ago, the West River meant much more to people living here. Their lives depended on it. Before the Vernon Dam was constructed and submerged them, these pictographs were among the only visible signs left of early human life here. However, a recently established and yet undisclosed archaeological dig along the river has produced exciting results, shedding new light on Abenaki history along the west.
I'm very sure that this site was a site that was inhabited for dating back 3,500 years down to about 500 years probably. So it would take in the late Archaic period and the beginning of the Woodland periods, the early Woodland, middle, and late Woodland periods. And this is a Lavana point, and this is made out of Onondaga flint from central New York State, which was traded in. This Lavana point right here is dating, from 1,000 to 500 years, or even maybe a little later than that. And definitely these Indians during that time were farming. They wouldn't have to wander in search of food anymore. This site on the West River, they lived there permanently. They had everything they wanted. There was good deer, there were a lot of nuts, there still are a lot of oak and beech, and some of the walnut trees that used to be here, which are no longer here, were here then too. The salmon came up the West River, and they would hole up in some deep holes, waiting for the right time for them to spawn and go up smaller streams. And this site is located near a smaller stream. This pottery, it's the earliest pottery ever made here in Vermont, dating 2,500 years. And the temper that they put into this pottery was very fine crushed white quartz. That temper was put in to help to take the heat so that the pot, when it was being fired, would not break up and explode on them. This is a very, very nice piece of pottery, very rare. This is a very nice fractured spear. Would have been used for probably spearing salmon. This is the basal end, the base of the projectile point, and it was hafted. The shaft of the spear was hafted here. The point to the spear, which would have been that entered the salmon or perhaps an animal, was broken off. These people were great artisans. With what they had to work with, their hands and stone, their craftsmanship was great. Some people, even perhaps today, once in a while, you hear them use the word savages. But these people were not savages. They were wonderful people. And we can learn a lot from them. We have learned one thing. They gave us many of the medicines that we take today to cure our ailments. They were using back hundreds of years ago. They were nice people, and they still are. Every day we learn something new. With that next scrape, with that trowel, you never know what you're going to be unearthing. These artifacts will be placed in a rightful place for them, where other people can see them and see the history that we are going to be finding out about. Yes, the Indians did live on the West River.
For these people, life along the West meant knowing certain riffles and pools like the backs of their hands. It meant living with the reality that peace could dissolve overnight in the uncontrolled rain-created torrents raging down through their world. How tragic, then, that despite being accustomed to deluge, the Abenaki would be engulfed by a flood of a different kind. A flood that moved up rivers. In 1724, Fort Dummer was constructed along the Connecticut, and soon the wave of new settlers would begin exploring the West River Valley. Within 30 years, the towns of Brattleboro, Dummerston, Newfane, and Townsend were chartered. By the turn of the century, every town in the watershed had been chartered and was growing. In their search for home sites, many settlers found the West's floodplains good fertile starting points.
We're up above, I guess, the dam here a few miles. I'm not sure how far, but we're definitely in a floodplain of the West River, and that's pretty noticeable by just the topography of this site. It's really level and flat, and as you get out of the floodplain, we rise pretty steeply on each side. But this floodplain's been developed through thousands of years of the river meandering through this area, and during flood times, depositing silts and sediments on either side of the river. An area like this would have been very important to the first settlers coming up here, because it would have two features. One, it would have very rich stone-free soils, very good for cultivation for crops. But also, in a floodplain like this as well, we probably would have had beaver here as well, which we have here today. And that would have been important because recently abandoned beaver ponds were sort of the settlers' first hayfields. They would come into a site like this, they wouldn't have to clear the forest. They would have, as you can see out here, a lot of standing grasses and sedges that could be cut as forage for livestock. So an area like this would have been important for settlement.
Whatever value people placed upon a river's power to transport and deposit rich soils was outweighed by the value they placed on its power, period. Water-driven mills propelled the growth of towns and economies in the main valley and smaller tributaries. The majority of these facilities were located off the main stem, along the banks of smaller rivers like the Rock and Winhall, brooks like Stickney, Smith, Mill, Wardsboro, and Ball Mountain. Evidence of two mills on the West River can be seen today, the dam in Londonderry